All right, everyone. Welcome to Headwaters Science Research Experience presentation night. I have the pleasure of introducing Angelina from South Korea. She was actually one of our students participating, from a foreign land, which is amazing. It's great to see that we have students interested in the program all across the world. We've also had students from India and also other regions in Europe as well. So it's fascinating that, we're able to be found during this crazy time. And it was my pleasure to work with her. She did an outstanding job, and you'll see some of the ups and downs regarding her research. So without further ado, Angelina, you can share your screen and we can get started.
Okay, thank you. Hello, my name is Angelina Ko. I'm from South Korea, and my research focused on effect of compost versus manure on radish. So the choice for my research was because of my passion in agriculture and sustainability. For example, regenerative agriculture is an agriculture method that aims for sustainability and environment-friendly way of agriculture by such as minimizing the use of fertilizer. I also found that the reduction of fertilizer helps solve the environmental issues, such as eutrophication, which is a buildup of algae in the water. Besides eutrophication, fertilizer depletes soil organic matter, which are important components of making healthy soil. And when they get depleted, it results in weak structure and there's no water infiltration, meaning water leaks off from the soil, worsening the effect of eutrophication. On the other hand, compost improves and increases the amount of soil organic matter, resulting in healthy soil. It results in good structure, and water infiltration is also good. And these benefits can actually help crops to grow better. And besides these, in some less advanced countries, like countries in Africa, there are pollution issues because of poor sewage system. And in those regions, if they make compost using human and livestock's manure, it can help those environmental issues. And it seems like compost could be a good replacement for fertilizer, but the problem is that if fertilizer does a significantly better job in growing crops than compost, then it'll be a big risk for farmers to replace fertilizer. So my research tried to answer the question, how do compost and fertilizer compare on the growth of Raphanus sativus? Raphanus sativus is a scientific name for radish, and specifically I use cherry bell radish because I was informed that it grows within 20 days. My hypothesis was that plants grown in the synthetic fertilizer treatment would slightly outperform the compost treatment group, but wouldn't observe a significant difference between the groups. And if this hypothesis turned out to be true, it could be a good indication that compost can replace synthetic fertilizer. So I first started off with making my own compost using a Berkeley method. So I created the compost using 30:1 carbon to nitrogen ratio. For nitrogen content, I used manure, grass clippings, and coffee grounds, as you can see on the bottom picture. And for carbon contents, I used dry leaves, soil, and twigs, as you can see in the top picture. So I first started off by building my own compost. I layered carbon content and nitrogen content alternatively until it reached a considerable size of 90 centimeter by 90 centimeter. I added some water, and at the end, I covered it up so the compost process could start. After building the compost, I had to mix it up every 2 days within 18 days to ensure that every part of the heap was going through the heating process and I was building a good compost pile. After making the compost, I went into the research methods. I created 2 beds, and each bed I applied either compost or fertilizer. After making the beds, I made 18 holes, and each hole I put the radish seed. Now this is the beginning of the research. It just started germinating. And this is the midway point of the research. As you can see, compost is doing better than fertilizer, surprisingly. And in fertilizer section, you can even see the moss growth, which could be an indication of eutrophication. I really hope that this kind of growth could have continued throughout the study, but it was a rainy and sunny season in Korea at the peak of pests hatching their eggs, and there were just too many caterpillars eating up the tender leaves of my radish. And at the end of my research, it resulted in this kind of situation. About half or less than half remained for each bed, and even the half were of poor health quality. Nevertheless, I could collect multiple data. I collected plant height, leaf width, number of leaves, final height, and width for each root. So for the results, these three graphs indicate the data over the time of 16 days. And for first two graphs, plant height and number of leaves, we could see that the slope of compost is higher than fertilizer, meaning that it's doing a better job in growing crops. And for the third graph, leaf width, although we can see a faster decline in growth for compost, for all data points in each day, compost was showing a greater value than fertilizer. And these are the data that I collected at the end of the research. For root width, compost mean is higher than fertilizer, but the error bars overlap, and when I did the t-test, p-value was higher than 0.05, indicating that there is no significant difference. Same applies to the final length. The compost mean was higher than fertilizer, but error bars overlap again, and p-value was higher than 0.05, and there was no significant difference. So the conclusion was that compost resulted in faster height and leaf growth, but no significant difference was found between the treatments for root width and final height. Thus, it was determined that compost has a more stimulating effect on Raphanus sativus growth, but doesn't result in overall differences in growth. And I find this conclusion to be compelling because this indicates that compost is a good replacement of fertilizer, not only for farmers, but also because it can help the environment, and also it can minimize the negative impacts fertilizer could have done. But also should note that there should be some further studies and discussions to be made. In this study, I used small sample, and of all 18 seeds that I planted, not all of them grew to a full size. And also there were a couple of influential confounding variables such as pest damage or animal footsteps during the research. So if I replicate my study again, I want to include bigger sample and also minimize those confounding variables. And I also want to do an additional study to analyze to what extent compost positively influence the soil health so that I can collect the quantified evidence for the improvements of soil health. These are my resources, and I want to thank everybody that helped me with my research, including Headwaters Institute and my mentor, Daniel, and my parents for helping me out throughout my research. And thank you for watching.
Yeah, so we typically do a little bit of a Q&A afterwards. So my question to you about your research is really back to your methods. If you scroll back to your plant beds whenever they were infested by caterpillars, as you say, it looks like the fertilizer group wasn't as impacted as the compost group. If you go down one more slide. Or at least that's just what it looks like to me. Are there any reasons why you might think this?
I honestly think these are some outliers of the group. I think if I had bigger sample for each group, compost could have had some of these incidents happening.
Okay. All right. And then do you believe that you would see the same results as you would with a larger sample size in terms of the patterns that you saw within the data?
Yeah, I think it's reasonable to think that I could see similar results because fertilizer gives more nutrients uh, and it's a more faster way of improving the plant growth. But compost has additional benefits other than the nutritional value because it actually improves the soil health, and in the long run, it could have a better growth than fertilizer. Yes.
All right, and it looks like from your background that that you have a pretty large agricultural facility that you had access to, right?
Yes.
So I'm curious about sort of your parents' thoughts on your research whenever they were conducting.
Mm.
How did your parents think about the differences between the compost and the fertilizer, especially in the early days when everything was going right?
Yeah. So the reason behind choosing this topic was also influenced by my dad because he owns a farm. His hobby is farming. And then alongside working with him, I got to do a lot of agriculture stuff with him, which is why I got into this passion of agriculture. And my dad was very happy when I brought up this topic because for the most part, he was happy because if I have leftover compost, he could use it instead of his fertilizer. And he was actually not using fertilizer because he was one of the person who believed that fertilizer wasn't that influential, and he believed that there are more environmental ways of growing plants other than using fertilizer. So he was very happy to see the results at the beginning, at least. And he actually used some of my compost to grow his crops.
Oh wow, that's fantastic. So yeah, so your compost is institutional grade, I guess. So yeah, so that's amazing to hear. Yeah. Well, Angelina, it was a pleasure listening to your research, and I hope you have a very successful path through your through whichever you'd like to do in your academic career.